everyone, and welcome to today's episode of The Gabot Show. I am super excited about today's guest, and as you can see, I took out the raven for the occasion. So what comes to mind when I say the word taxidermy? For most people, it simply means stuffing an animal, but in reality, it's much more than that. I think it's an art form, really. From the ancient Greek, taxidermy translates to arranging skin or moving skin. Taxi meaning moving or arranging, and then derma meaning skin. Today's guest is New York City's premier taxidermist. She has won several awards, and her clients range from museums to high-end designers, gallerists, and collectors. And her specialties are birds, small mammals, and anatomic anomalies, with a select number of commissions open for pets. She is also co-author of the book Stuffed Animals, A Modern Guide to Taxidermy. Please welcome Divya Anantharaman.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Welcome, Divya. Thank you so much for taking the time today. I'm so excited to chat with you.
I'm excited as well.
I think the first question that everyone is probably wondering, how did you get into taxidermy? Like, what sparked that interest?
Sure. So I got into taxidermy mainly so when I was growing up, I grew up in a big city. I grew up in Miami. So I wasn't really around a ton of nature. There is, of course, like birds and stuff that you see in the park or like someone's backyard and things like that. And of course, in Florida, there are all sorts of lizards and other things crawling around. But a lot of like the megafauna, like, big animals, like things like deer and animals like that people in more rural places or even suburban places, people who see those animals, I didn't really see things like that. So my exposure to them was mainly from, drawings and photos and in books. And if we ever went to the Natural History Museum or the Science Museum, in those dioramas. So I was always really fascinated by taxidermy in those places because I was like, this is how I can get close to animals because they're in here. And unlike some other kids, I was like, I wasn't really repelled or repulsed by them being dead animals. I was like, oh, I'm so curious about how someone, how and why someone decided to preserve this animal and put it on display. And another way, I was also grateful too, because I was like, someone did this, and now a kid like me who is in, a middle of an like urban center can see this animal and connect to it and get close to it in a way that's not even possible if I travel to where those animals are. So, if I saw a lion, like, there's no guarantee that if I travel to Africa, I would see a lion. I have to pay a lot of money to do that, and also, get really lucky as well. Whereas in that, in that museum diorama, I was just able to go in and see a lion, just like by walking through those museum doors. So that sort of sparked my interest in taxidermy as just like as an interest. What started me doing it as a hobby was just collecting books and videos about it. And sort of like learning as much as I could just from being self-taught. It's not really a career I thought I would have because, again, I was like, I like living in a big city. I'm not really moving into a rural place. And I thought, I had a misconception myself that taxidermy was something that maybe you could get lucky and get a museum job. But otherwise you would just, I was like, otherwise in a city, I don't think anyone would be interested in it because they would want like, when you think of taxidermy, you think of like deer heads or like, memorials made to, or something made to like memorialize like something memorial to like make a memorial to like a hunting trip or something. So I was like, that's not really what I want to do. I want to like, work on these small birds or work on these things that I guess other people that I had yet to see taxidermy of. They existed, but I just had yet to see them out, in myself as like a little kid. So I was like, you know what, this is going to be my little hobby. And as I grew older, I was like, oh, I guess this will just continue to be a hobby that I have and not really, I wasn't really sure I could turn it into a profession. And I only turned it into a profession after a while of it being a hobby. So I kind of, was working in the fashion industry for quite a bit after college. And then there was a small museum here that was looking for someone to teach taxidermy classes. I'd actually gone there to take taxidermy classes because they were offering them. But after a while, that teacher had moved on, and then they reached out to me to teach them. And I was still working in fashion. So I was doing that on the weekends. And as a lot of people who are artists or small business owners know, it's like a lot of times pursuing your passion
The
is
hustle,
working like,
the hustle.
yeah, the hustle, working like many jobs at a time. So that's how it started. So it started there, and then eventually those classes gained more and more interest, and I started seeing a demand for taxidermy in the cities. And at that time I was in New York. At that time, after I left high school, I moved to New York City, and so while I was working in New York after school and working here, I was like, there is a demand for it here.
Yeah.
That's different than, I guess, what people have the conception of as far as taxidermy goes. But yeah, so that's how it started. That's my whole
Wow.
story.
So it really did start like just a hobby. And it just goes to show for everyone watching at home that you could really turn a passion into something else if you keep doing it. And I know you have roots in South Asia and Jamaica, and my parents are from the Caribbean as well. They're from Dominican Republic. And I can't help but to think that maybe even due to religion, but I don't know because my parents aren't that religion, but family is, you know how it is in those smaller islands. Like, I feel like if I told some family members that I was becoming a taxidermist, some of them wouldn't understand and might even panic. How was your career choice received by family and friends when you said to them, I'm leaving fashion, I'm in New York, I'm leaving fashion, this is what I'm going to do now?
Oh my gosh. So like when I even made the decision to go into fashion, they were like, what the heck? Like, we moved to America and like all these
we sacrificed so much, and this is what you're deciding.
Which they did, I'm like, we definitely did. But I'm like, you also sacrificed so your kid could do some job, to do some weird job that didn't have back in, or that you didn't think was like a possibility before. So like when I even wanted to go into fashion, they were very skeptical. They were just like, being an artist wasn't something, or like going into a creative field wasn't something that they had grown up with. Like, both my parents came from pretty, they came from pretty small towns, and they were like, you go to school, like going to school was a big deal. And if you went to school, you were going to do something that would make you money, and that would like level you up as far as stability and stuff goes.
And justify the sacrifice.
Yes, to justify the sacrifice. And here I am saying, I want to go be a fashion designer. And they're like, what the heck do you mean? Like, no. And I was like, well, I'm going to work on it. So I worked at it. Like, I went to school for it. I like, I really had to, and any like first generation kid will know this, of many immigration experiences, you have to really prove yourself. So, I just busted my butt to prove myself that, and to prove to them that, like, I'm not going to make the money of a doctor or an engineer or a lawyer or whatever, whatever like these other jobs are, but I will make some money, and I will be able to support myself and make a career out of it. And so once I did that, they were like, okay, cool. And they were really happy. And they were like, our daughter's a fashion designer in New York. I was working for a lot of the like corporate fashion jobs, because that is where, at that time, especially like, I mean, now there are a ton of independent labels, but, for someone that doesn't have the generational wealth, like working at a corporate fashion job is sort of how you can be stable and still do fashion. So I was working there. They were super proud of me. And then, once the taxidermy classes started to pick up, and once I realized I'm spreading myself too thin and I can't do these two jobs, I started going freelance in fashion, and was like, I'm only doing fashion jobs on the side. And they're like, what are you doing full time? And I was like, well, I have this taxidermy job that, I pursued this hobby in taxidermy. And for my mom, she was a biology teacher, so she was familiar with taxidermy.
Okay, well, that's easier to sort of navigate when your mom is a biology teacher.
Yeah. However, she was only really understanding of doing it for the sake of science. She was like, why do these weirdos have it in their house? Like, why would someone have something like that at home? And I was like, it's the same reason you'd have a plant or like a painting of a bird or something, else of nature. Is like, you want a piece of nature in your home. And she was just like, I just don't get that. And then the extra nervousness of being a small business, of being like self-employed, she was like, how do you have health insurance? How do you do this? How do you do
So
that?
many
Like, you know,
questions.
all of
So
the questions about that. And honestly, some of the answers were not that great. I mean, in Canada, I think you have it a bit better on the health insurance front.
we have free healthcare. I mean, free healthcare. We call it free healthcare, but really
Yeah.
there's so much, we pay so many taxes. So, you
Yeah.
know, it balances out. But yes, if knock on wood,
Yeah.
anything were to happen to me, I could go to the hospital and I'm
Yeah.
not paying. I just go when,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Here it's a very precarious situation. But
Yeah.
like, you know, she had all these very legitimate worries and like was so like, why would you do this to yourself again?
Yeah.
But then I was
Yeah.
like, listen, I have never asked you guys for money. I have never asked you guys for like anything. I've always taken care of myself. And I actually did like, and probably a lot of other like immigrant kids can relate to this too, but
Yeah.
I actually was working in taxidermy for a few years before
Yeah.
even telling them.
Of course,
that
because you
I
were a
quit.
smart woman and you knew
Yeah.
exactly what would happen if you just showed up saying, hey,
Yeah.
you know, I'm doing this now.
Yeah.
Okay, so now I'm assuming it's accepted. I'm assuming your family, your parents
Yeah.
are okay with it. I mean, you've done really well with it. How would you
Yeah.
say taxidermy has changed you? Like, has it changed you, or has it changed your relation or thoughts, you know, in regards to death?
Mhm. For sure. I think that, you know, I think it does change you because you're working with death every day. You're looking at, you're sort of looking at, you know, you're looking at death in the face every single day on your workbench, or even if I'm not working on like the initial processing, even if I'm working on finishing something, you're pretty much surrounded by death. And a lot of people would think that is so morbid, that it's so sad or dirty, or there are a lot of negative connotations around death. And granted, like, death is a very serious thing in our lives. It's also a part of the natural life cycle too. It's something that's inevitable to everybody. And so I think being around it, instead of seeing it as something that's so like, that is so sad and brooding and all of that, it kind of just forces me to like shift my perspective and think about what I can do while I'm living and trying to make the most of my time here. And trying to leave like some kind of impact that's going to help other people make the most of their time here. And especially working with animals, I want people to see, you know, whether people are using taxidermy for artistic purposes or scientific purposes or something in between, it's all from like that appreciation of animals. And I think that it makes me think of that, you know, like when you're around death, you kind of think of how final and precious life is. So
of course,
yeah,
you
it definitely
enjoy,
helps
it's
me.
changed your perspective, and you probably enjoy life to the fullest every single day, because you
I mean, I
know
try to. I try to.
Well,
Ideally, ideally I would.
yeah,
But
we all
yeah.
went through a pandemic as well, so I do understand that not every day is amazing, but yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Now let's talk a little bit about the history of taxidermy. Of course, one can think of the Egyptians who mummified their cats and brought them with them to the afterlife, but mummies were actually created in a religious context, unlike taxidermy, which developed from a curiosity about nature. When did taxidermy actually begin?
So it's kind of hard to say, like to say like when the first person did taxidermy, just because of the way that these things are, you know, the way that these records are kept. Also, like when you talk to any taxidermist, they're going to say taxidermy is something very specific. Like they won't lump in mummification or bone cleaning or anything like that with taxidermy. To me, it's all part of animal preservation, which is like the bigger picture and sort of like how I look at it. But a lot of taxidermists look at taxidermy as no, it's only when you skin the animal and move that skin onto a replicated form. They're like, that is the only thing considered taxidermy. So if we're looking at if we're saying taxidermy, if we're not using taxidermy as shorthand for all other kinds of animal preservation, if we're just looking at taxidermy as taxidermy, I think some of the oldest pieces, I think one of the oldest like surviving pieces is a crocodile hanging from a church in Italy. There used to be this tradition of hanging crocodiles from churches, from church ceilings. And I think that dates to the that piece dates to around the 1500s. But it could very well be that people were doing what we know now as taxidermy before that. It's just that so much of it was done as so much of it was done by individuals and they might not have documented everything. We're in the age of documenting everything now, whether we post it online or
too
not.
much.
Yeah, we kind of document stuff too much. Whereas back then, I mean, writing and reading, depending on where you were, like language and the tools for documenting something weren't accessible to everybody. So we can only go by what has been documented and what of that documentation has survived. So
yeah,
in that way, we'll say like the 1500s, but
yeah,
humans have been making things for so long that it could very well be that something
longer than that.
Yeah, something was even earlier than that.
And we lost a whole bunch of things during the Dark Ages as well. So many
Very
things
true,
were lost there. So who knows? And then after that, I think a lot of people associate taxidermy as well with the Victorians in the 1800s. Like they were huge on the whole, I know I'm not going to say that, not the death culture, but they were fascinated by human death, animal death, like the whole, there's even mourning rings for those who are vintage aficionados. Like women used to get mourning rings and all kinds of things. So that happened then. And I think there was an explosion of new techniques and tools at that time. Yeah.
So taxidermy did have a huge sort of like upswing or like a big gain in popularity, and just in among everyday people, real taxidermy just became really popular in that Victorian time. So a lot of it was, again, the fascination and sort of the culture that was being built around death, around mourning, around grieving. There was also a very whimsical aspect of it too. Like there was, this is one of the one of the most famous documented pieces of taxidermy, when taxidermy was dressed up or anthropomorphized, where they would get like a mouse and put a little hat and tuxedo on it and dress it up as if it's going to, a wedding or a party or something. So there was such a multifaceted aspect of it from there. And also it was when a lot of, it was when like colonialism was in full blown effect. So a lot of it too was from people traveling the world, seeing things and extract, it was very extractive culture. So they were extracting things. They're like, well, let's bring this back home to study it. And obviously you're not going to bring a tiger back home alive.
No.
So they're,
so it was a way of learning about animals that weren't necessarily in your country, in your city, in your town. That was the way that you saw things. You didn't necessarily travel. You would, like you said, you bring a tiger and taxidermy the tiger. And who are some of the pioneers of taxidermy? I know I read a little bit about John Edmonston, which has a super interesting story. Is there any, like, if anyone is watching this right now, they're interested in learning a little bit more about these pioneers, who would you recommend they look up?
Sure. So there are a lot of like really well documented taxidermists like Carl Akeley and Leon Prey and, William Hornaday and names like that. For me, the ones I really like are the more people with more underrepresented. Oh my gosh, words are hard today.
For me too.
Underrepresented identities. So John Edmonston is a really fascinating story to me, because he was a formerly enslaved person who was in Guyana and learned taxidermy from Charles Waterton, and who was another like very well-known taxidermist. And Charles Waterton actually is really interesting because he did very scientific work, but also really bizarre work, like, weird like zombie creatures and stuff. So for side note of another person to check out, but John Edmonston learned taxidermy from him, and then eventually found himself in Edinburgh, and there was doing taxidermy for the Natural History Museum there and teaching taxidermy classes. And one of his most famous students is Charles Darwin. So Darwin was going to school for medicine. And back then, going to medical school is still hard now, but back then it was really hard because you had to do things like observe surgeries, and there may or may not have been anesthesia, like really, really brutal. And so Darwin was a little lost about what he was going to do, and just on a whim decided, hey, I'm going to take this taxidermy class. It's not far from school. And, why not? Why not take a taxidermy class, right? Like, what else are you going to do in the 1800s? So, so he takes this class with Edmund Stone, and then it turns to a series of classes. And it's said that, and we get these accounts from his diaries. And so it's said that, as he was taking these classes, Edmund Stone was sharing his passion for animals and sharing his love of nature, and talking about Guyana and talking about all of the nature he would see there versus what he's seeing in Edinburgh. And that inspired Darwin to pursue natural history and this aspect of science as opposed to being a medical student. So, and of course the skills of taxidermy, all those preservation skills, Darwin couldn't bring back all those finches and all of those other animals that helped prove his theories later on. He couldn't bring those back without taxidermy. So Edmund Stone's a really, really cool character in history, is a really cool figure in history of taxidermy that I think more people should learn about. Another figure I love is an American woman named Martha Maxwell. A lot of people say, oh, being a woman in taxidermy, that must be new. And I'm like, it definitely isn't. Like, there are a lot of, there have been women through history, just much like anyone with a marginalized identity, they are just erased from time. But we do have some surviving accounts of Martha Maxwell, and she was really interesting because of how ahead of her time she was. So she was putting animals into naturalistic displays. So instead of just putting a bird on a stick, she would make a little tree and use a branch and put some leaves on it, or preserve the plants from its area and build them that way. So people were so shocked in seeing this work. They were like, oh my gosh, it's like I'm walking in the forest, except you're not, because it's because it's that illusion of life. And she was also a very independent woman too. Like, she kept her finances separate from her husband in certain ways. Like, she did support him for some time when he had failed business adventures and stuff, but in some ways, she was like, well, I do have this cabin out in Colorado that I purchased. I do have this and I do have that. And so there were times that she left her husband to go and work and to go and take time away. Which was
unheard of back then.
Yeah, it was so unheard of back then. And that boldness, I think, is so incredible. I think one of her boldest things that she did is, she would speak and show her work herself. And so much that she was invited to the World's Fair in Philadelphia. And, at that time, you wouldn't have a woman speaking in public.
Which is crazy. It's so strange.
But she was speaking. So she went to install a huge, they wanted her to install a huge, not even a diorama, but just immersive exhibit of her work. So she had this whole Colorado scene of all of her work. So you have deer and moose and she had live prairie dogs running around and real water features as well, just to make it, just to keep people on edge. Is that a real animal or is it not?
Or not.
So she had all of that there, and she titled the whole thing Women's Work. So that was pretty amazing for that time to go there and be I'm going to do this installation and make a statement.
No confusion. It was a women's work. That's awesome. Okay. That's great. As mentioned earlier, a lot of people think taxidermy is simply stuffing an animal, but it's a lot more tedious than that. And you need to take accurate measurements and all the specimen's anatomy inside and out. Can you walk us through the process of actually working on a specimen from beginning to end? How do you go about?
Sure. So the beginning is, you got the specimen. So in my case, it's either if it's something for a client, if it's something that I have in stock, most of what I work on are birds. So it's a lot of domestic birds, and a lot of domestic birds pass away. So people will sell specimens to taxidermists. There's a market for that. But nothing is nothing is killed. Nothing I use is killed for the sake of taxidermy, and nothing is illegally taken or anything like that.
So natural death and things like that happen.
Yeah, and most of the birds I work on are domestic because in the US and in Canada too, a lot of wild birds are protected. So almost every bird except for the invasive ones are protected. So most of almost everything I work on is domestic. And so there's procuring the specimen, and the specimens are kept frozen until they're ready to be worked on. So then they're thawed. Then after they're thawed, I take measurements. So, there are, let's say like something like a starling. So all starlings have very similar features, but just like people, individual animals can be a little bit different. So in addition to knowing, looking at the animal, understanding its behavior, looking at how it stands, does it stand more, where does it put its weight when it's standing? Like where are the wings on the body? Like what's the eye look like? In addition to like observing these other living characteristics, there's also using the actual individual there to take measurements from. So I'll take certain measurements from it, and make any notes if there's anything unusual that I have to keep in mind. And then I'm removing the skin from it. So you skin it, you take the skin off and remove all of the inner body. And people think that part is probably really gross, but the body comes out in just one, it comes out in one clean package.
But then it's funny how people think that, yet everyone's eating chicken and turkey.
I know, yeah. I think the chicken and turkey is probably like a bit grosser, because they have to like actually take all the organs out and everything. Whereas everything is just in one neat little, bird-shaped package. So
yeah. So I think it's funny how people think that way. Anyways, my apologies. Continue.
So once it's skinned, then you're cleaning the skin. So I'll take all the fat off of the skin. If any bones are used like with birds, you use the leg bones and the wing bones. So I'll clean those bones off. I'll remove the marrow from the bones. So you're getting the skin nice and clean, and then you're applying a preservative to the skin. So it can be a liquid preservative or a dry preservative. With birds, the preservative tends to be brushed on. Or it can be, with a mammal, you actually tan the skin. So you're turning it into sort of like tanning leather. You're changing the chemical structure of the skin so it can be preserved and so it won't deteriorate over time. So once that skin is preserved, then you mount it onto a form that's anatomically accurate. And of course you have to make that form, or you can buy it for certain animals, like very commonly mounted animals like deer or squirrels or something like that. Things like that you can buy taxidermy forms for, but again, you have to fit it to your individual. So what I normally do, because I mostly work on birds, is I make all of my forms because there's no one selling like a starling taxidermy form or something like that. So I make it based on the measurements, based on a second set of measurements I take from the carcass that was removed. So there's carving that and sculpting that. And then once the skin is mounted on the form, then you sew it up. And then after that, you groom it and then dry it. And then there's finishing work. And the finishing work is sort of the really fun part because it's like doing makeup and stuff.
Of course.
That's like adding the lifelike color back to areas like, also on a bird, it would be like the feet. The feet will turn sort of like a muddy color because there's no more blood flowing in them. There's no more life. So you have to bring them back to a lifelike color. And just making everything look lifelike. And then you put it onto its final base, and that is sort of
Next time on the Gabot Show, what would your advice be for people who want to keep their cat or their dog forever, and what are some of the alternatives to taxidermy? Because I think people don't realize that having your again, I'm not here to judge, but I'm just saying having your cat sitting on the couch forever isn't the same thing as when your cat actually sits on the couch.
Yeah, so